let's talk about the panic of surrender that has been overtaking the neocons as Trump's national security strategy released has been touted as a plan that essentially admits that the United States cannot fight China and Russia directly. Now, we can start with you, Carl. There is a lot being made, especially in neocon outlets like the New York Times here. Superpower competition, the missing chapter in Trump's security strategy. He's shifting from discussion of long-lasting competition among the world's biggest economies and nuclear powers. Carl, what do you make of this? Is the United States retreating? Is there an admission here that in the national security strategy, the U.S. just cannot approach with war Russia and China directly?
Well, I think of it as a tactical pivot. I mean, obviously, they have not given up on the goal of U.S. primacy over the world. What they did is they hit their wall. They hit their head on the wall of reality recently, and this is a result of the Ukraine fiasco as well as Trump's disastrous trade war. They did not realize China can and will retaliate, and China has this leverage called rare earth. China still dominates the rare earth supply chain, and so they cannot proceed, as planned before to start a three-front war, like some were saying. So now they have to do it strategically. I mean, they still planned for world domination. They just realized, okay, now we got to do it a little smarter. And their plan is to shore up their control over their quote-unquote neighborhood, which is the West Hemisphere. This is why they're now focusing on Venezuela, Latin America, and even Africa. They're talking about Christian genocide in Nigeria. These are all attempts to push out Chinese and Russian influence from these regions and to prepare United States for the eventual pivot back to confront Russia and China. So this is a pause. This is a strategic pause. It's not a change in the strategic direction. This is my take.
Yeah, and KJ, to you, I wanted to just pull up a quote from this article saying that this is what Trump said in his first national security strategy back in 2018. China and Russia challenge American power, influence interests, eroding American security and prosperity. They're determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries and to control information and data, and to oppress their societies and expand their influence. KJ, why has the language changed then? Why does it seem, according to the neocons, according to these think tanks, why does it seem that the United States in this national security strategy is backing off of Russia and China? Do you agree with this? What's your assessment?
Well, I don't agree that it's backing off on Russia and China. If anything, there's much, much more specificity on how to aggress and contain China. It's surprisingly much more specificity than is usual for this document. Usually, you have to understand the national security strategy is the first in a flush of documents: the national defense strategy, nuclear posture review, national military strategy, missile defense review, etc. And all of these things create policy and appropriations. Essentially, it's a business plan for empire, or a business plan for the capitalists of the empire. And it sets forth, mission and vision and goals, and then it does a kind of assessment of resources, and then it notes, struggles and challenges and how it's going to, quote unquote, resolve them. And of course, it throws out red meat for everybody as well. It's a little bit of what they call a Christmas tree. It has the dangling ornaments that are designed to be shiny and to distract. And underneath the tree, you have the gifts. And you have to understand that, if there are flowers for Russia, there is also a shotgun and a crate full of shotgun shells for the United States. So you have to be very, very careful not to be distracted by the shiny ornaments. And you have to ask, what is it really saying? It is essentially continuity of the US project for containing and contesting and eventually taking down China. In order to understand that, you have to do two things. One is you have to read for the contradictions, because it's packed full of contradiction. So even as it says that it wants to retreat and focus on the Western Hemisphere, it talks about controlling and maintaining secure and reliable supply chains and access to critical minerals. It talks about the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is code for controlling the South China Sea and the Pacific area, and to restrain China. And of course, it has a lot of language around Taiwan and quote unquote deterring against Taiwan. So all of that signals is that it's simply a cosmetic change. They put lipstick or a different lipstick on the pig, but it is still the beast, the pig of imperialism that still has an imperial agenda to take down China. And along the way, they've understood that they need to kind of resequence, not retreat, but resequence regarding Russia. And they need to consolidate more power, quote unquote, in the Western Hemisphere, so they can build out the kind of supply chains and resources that they need to re-wage kinetic war against China. So nothing has changed. Don't be deceived. It is the Wolfowitz doctrine, simply continued with a little bit of sparkly little, little decorations on the side.
Well, what's very interesting about this, Carl, is that there's a lot in it made about burden sharing. And I wanted to actually pull up at the same time that this was announced, that this came out, there was a paper put out by a European think tank. I believe this is the European version of the, I think it's the Atlantic Council. The U.S. must beware of the deepening Russia-China axis. And essentially what this argues is that what Europe is the one that's warning now the U.S. that it needs to be taking on Russia and China. And all throughout the national security strategy, Carl, there's all kinds of references made about the so-called allies needing to take up more responsibility. What do you make of this? How does this factor into what KJ was saying and the overall aim here?
Well, I think this is Trump's baby. I mean, Trump has been complaining about the so-called U.S. allies riding on the coattail of the U.S. empire, and that now they need to pay up. They're trying to, compartmentalizing their imperial project right now. So in Europe, what they want to do is they want to shift the burden of the proxy war against Russia from United States to its European vassal states. This is what they mean when they say, they need to shoulder more burden. They want it. And on top of that, they want these U.S. client states to shove out more money to buy U.S. weapons. This is why they're pushing, for the 5% defense spending, 5% GDP defense spending for NATO countries, and they're pushing the same on Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. It's like KJ said, this is nothing new. This is just they're trying to seek more opportunity for the U.S. military industrial complex, while shying away from quote unquote responsibilities, which is direct U.S. involvement. This is outsourcing the empire. And what interesting thing is, I think they are now prioritizing. I mean, I don't think that, like I said, I don't think they gave up the goal of containing China and Russia, except right now after they realize China hold the upper hand in rare earth supply chain. This is why they're now prioritizing the supply, to shore up the U.S. economic position. This is why that clause has now moved above containing China and maintaining a free Indo-Pacific, because they realize if they can't fix the supply chain issue for the U.S. military-industrial complex, there's really nothing they can do to confront China. You can't confront China when your military depends on components and critical resources coming from China. So now they're trying to do a military-industrial complex decoupling from the Chinese supply chain. That's what they're working on. That's why they're focusing on building addressing the domestic supply chain vulnerability. So they're trying to address the rare earth supply issues before they can, finally get to the big confrontation with China. So I think this is what's going on.
Well, KJ, let's take a look inside some of this. First, there is here reestablishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia as major points here of what many are saying is a shift in how the U.S. deals with Russia, essentially wanting a cessation of hostilities and maybe even normalizing ties. But you pointed out to me before the show that there's a major section here within Asia, win the economic future and prevent military confrontation, saying to thrive at home, we must successfully compete there, aka the Indo-Pacific, quote unquote, and we are. Talk about what you think this means, because there's a lot here, and there's a lot of emphasis on economics and almost an acknowledgement that the U.S. is not, in fact, as strong as it makes it itself out to be, or maybe should be. Oh, sorry, KJ, you're muted.
We have
Continue.
to look at the contradictions in the document. One way I invite people to read this is that when you are doing programming, there's this thing called code, which actually makes things happen. And there's stuff called remarks, which you can put in comments. You can put in anything you want to. Remarks are supposed to explain what the code is doing, but they may or may not. But regardless of the point, code is what makes things happen. And remarks are simply ancillary, comments. And so you have to distinguish the code from the remarks. And clearly, there's a lot of stuff which is simply code. It's boilerplate stuff that they always put in. This is the gifts on the Christmas tree. Something for everybody. But if you dial down into the code, and you'll see this because there are core contradictions, is that the United States it considers itself to have a defense perimeter that encompasses the Pacific. It specifically talks about defending the first island chain, controlling the first island chain. And it's very, very concrete and very specific about how it will continue to do that. And it talks about why Taiwan Island is so important strategically and geostrategically and economically. All of that is laid out. And so we have to understand that regardless of what looks like retreat or isolationism or anything like that, is simply resequencing, and it's a division of labor, and it's a strategic sequencing that they're reconsidering. That is what is going on right now. Just kind of a side comment is when they talk about maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific, again we have to remind our audience, if they're not already aware of it, is that most of the trade going through the South China Sea is either going to or from China. There is no reason for the United States to militarize the area in order to protect trade that is going to China or from China. So in itself, it is an absurd notion. But what we can understand here is that what is being put forth is a kind of offensive/defensive realist position, stripped free of the kind of liberal internationalism that characterized previous NSS. For example, the 2022, that was all about liberal internationalism and making sure the international order was not being overrun by authoritarians and maintaining democracy. That language has been stripped out, and thank goodness, because it was so hypocritical and nauseating. But instead, they're talking in a certain kind of realist, cold, hard language and it still has some of the kind of flowery, ponies and unicorns and bread and roses for everybody, as well as clearly strong pretensions to supremacy and primacy. People think that this is a kind of retreat from primacy towards prioritization or restraining. It's not. It still has the same primacist conceits, and you can see it in the language all the way across. The strongest economy, the most robust industrial base, the most advanced science and tech, unrivaled soft power, etc. It just goes on and on. So that primacist Wolfowitz mindset is still there.
Yeah, and it certainly is a rebranding, and I think that's why it's so important that you say, KJ, that you have to read it very carefully. You have to read the contradictions, because there's a lot of branding in there that would contradict exactly that. But when both are present, when the contradictions are present together, we have to determine what is actually most important. It's actually what's so incredible here. This is what I think is, Carl, something to look out for when you talk about contradictions. Predisposition to non-interventionism, where it says that America's founders laid a clear preference for non-interventionism in the affairs of other nations and made the clear basis that just as human beings possess God-given equal natural rights, all nations are entitled by the laws of nature in nature's God to a separate and equal station with respect to one another. For a country, though, whose interests are as numerous and diverse as ours, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. Yet this predisposition should set a high bar for what constitutes justified intervention. And Carl, I mean, during the Obama administration, when he first came in 2008, he said, "I'm not for dumb wars. I oppose dumb wars." And then what do we get? We got more wars. We got smart wars. So, Carl, this feels a lot like that kind of moment, a total rebrand. What say you, and what's your assessment of this?
Exactly. I mean, they're right now, I like the term KJ is using, strategic sequencing. They're now saying, okay, let's focus on homeland security, borders, Western Hemisphere, which really ties up to the same thing, which is the Neo-Monroe's doctrine, to shore up U.S. position in its own hemisphere. Number three is economic security, reindustrialization, supply chain. Now, the reason they put that there, this is again the recent Trump defeat in the trade war, because China holds the upper hand in the supply chain. So they want to address all the domestic U.S. vulnerability first, before they realize they need to do that before they can really confront China. So this is why China and Indo-Pacific is put on a to-do list, but on the bottom of the list, on number 4. And this is just to do imperialism, but smarter. This is something what Professor John Mearsheimer has always advocated. U.S. should make up with Russia to refocus on China, but they realize that to refocus on China, they have to go maybe not the direct route. They have to refocus on China by enforce U.S. domination in its own neighborhood, and places like Africa, before they can confront China head on. And another thing the mentioning about first island chain is they want the nations of the first island chain to pay up. Whether it's government of Japan, Korea, or Taiwan, they want these countries to continue to plow billions of dollars to buy outdated, expensive American weapon systems. I mean, but that's basically more of the same, because a lot of this is just a grid for the U.S. military-industrial complex to stir up the tension, so they can keep on recycle back the dollar surpluses from Japan, from Korea, from Taiwan back to the pockets of the U.S. arms manufacturers.
Mm. Yeah, and KJ, I want to pull up what has been said since the release of the national security strategy. Pete Hegseth spoke at the Reagan Foundation at the Residential Library. Here is what he said, and I think it speaks to those contradictions.
As a result, the war focus. As a result, the War Department will not be distracted by democracy building, interventionism, undefined wars, regime change, climate change, woke moralizing, and feckless nation building. We will instead put our nation's practical, concrete interests first. We will deter war. We will advance our interests. We will defend our people. Peace is our goal. And in service of that objective, we will always be ready to fight and win decisively if called upon. As part of this mission, we are asking American taxpayers to fund the world's greatest military. We're asking mothers and fathers across America to trust us with their most precious resource, their sons and daughters.
So there you have it. Trust us. Where have we heard this before, KJ? It sounds very familiar. But to you, talk about your reaction to what's been said since then here.
Well, what he talks about, and it's a common theme, peace through strength, is actually it's the neo-realist. It's offensive neo-realism. It's John Mearsheimer's theory of international affairs. Essentially, the global system is anarchic. There is no Leviathan controlling it. States are the primary agents. States are self-interested, and you can never be sure of the intentions of other states. Therefore, and this is the difference between offensive and defensive realism, is that you have to maximize power. In other words, by becoming maximally powerful, becoming more powerful than all the other states, this is how you create stability. This is the notion of peace through strength. So he's simply elucidated John Mearsheimer's offensive realism. And essentially what this does is that it turns the entire planet into an armed madhouse, which is what is going on right now, especially in the Pacific. But because of this, we are facing serious contradictions inside, the domestic affairs. We are no longer able to have a standard of living that is commensurate with, the GDP of the country. But we also have to understand this is the logic of empire. The US is an empire. The carnivore is not going to become a vegetarian regardless of what it says. And it needs fresh blood. It needs to constantly expand. It needs to control the planet. And this is simply the most recent, exposition of this take. The U.S. is an empire. The national security strategy is the business plan of the empire. And Pete Hegseth is simply pointing out, we are going to keep the empire going as we see fit and as is necessary, and we cannot dial back from that. The empire is reliant on extraction from the periphery. It has to continually be extracting from the periphery, and it also has to dominate the periphery. And everything else is ancillary to that. The quote-unquote allies are simply vassals, and they are all having, this is essentially they're having their rents hiked. And the message from the slumlord is, all of you are going to have to pay more rent. And the reason for that is because we own you and we own your countries. Everybody be ready to pay up.
Carl, to you, your reaction to Hegseth, anything that KJ said?
Yeah, I think KJ has summarized pretty well. What I did notice is they're talking about, when they're talking about building focusing on the economic aspect, they're actually talking about building an economic coalition against China. So they pose that as part of building U.S. economic security. It's not just reindustrialization, supply chain. It's actually building a economic coalition of the willing against China. But this is the contradiction comes from, because Trump at the same time, he's slapping tariffs left and right against these so-called partner countries. Japan in particular is under great intense pressure right now because Japan's economy depend large part on export to markets like the United States. Yet it's expected to take on the brunt of confronting China in Indo-Pacific at the same time when U.S. is putting a lot of economic pressure on Japan. So I don't know how that it's actually going to work out in the long term, because there's a lot of realist impulse in this document, but in practice, Trump administration being Trump administration often throw out very contradictory policies that actually sabotage its goals. So I'm taking a wait and see approach to see how this can actually be implemented. Like KJ pointed out, this is just code commentary. This is not even the actual the policy that's actually been put in place in the ground. So I'm always taking the wait and see approach.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there is a definite, because as you said earlier, Carl, Ukraine, I mean, that is a defeat. The trade war with China, that is a defeat. I mean, there is real reason for the U.S. to, as an empire, to like lick its wounds and figure out other ways of doing things. But I think the most important element for me is that what is the United States empire doing to continue its overall agenda and to meet its interests, which have to be defined. And I think they are being defined. Not everyone is against this national security strategy in the neocon think tankistan and those elites who really dictate policy.